Good evening. Good evening. Once more time. Good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you. We know that most of us have not had dinner, therefore we're a little weak in our responses. But when you hear the speaker and all, you will forget about even having dinner, I understand. That's what I understand. Welcome here to this lecture this evening. It's sponsored by, of course, the Brooks Institute and the African American Faculty and Staff Association. And so again, we want to welcome you this evening, and we know that you're in for a real treat. This closes out the African American History program here at Penn Valley, and African American history is American history. Although left out of most of the textbooks, it is still a part of American history. And therefore, when we meet at these kind of occasions and celebrate this great history, we ask everyone to celebrate with us because we're all in this together. As the late Whitney Young once said in a speech, we might have come here on different ships. We're in the same boat now. We breathe the same polluted air, drink the same polluted water, and live in the same polluted communities, but this is America. What we've been saying she is, we hope one day she will be. But it will take all of us to make that come true. So again, I want to welcome you here on behalf of the Institute as well as the African American Faculty and Staff Association. That being said, I'd like to introduce to you the president of this great institution, Mr. Joe Seabrooks. Please welcome him.
Well, good evening. Good evening. Listen, before I give you some very, very brief welcome remarks, we have to acknowledge the greatness in the room. The institute that's named after the great Alvin Brooks deserves a level of recognition that I don't think we always give. And so could we please for a moment acknowledge the great Alvin Brooks for giving his time, his life, his legacy to his alma mater, MCC-Penn Valley. I also would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Board of Trustee member, Trustee Tober. Could you please recognize him? As I welcome you this evening, there's three things I need you to keep in your forebrain. The three words I want you to remember: context, preservation, and legacy. Say context. The context from which we live in today is not something that came out of thin air. The context from which we live in today comes from a historical context. And tonight, you're going to have the privilege of being able to put that context in focus in a way that rarely people get that opportunity. Say preservation. What we must do is to preserve that context, because in these contemporary times, sometimes we have an illusion that the life that we live today has no relevancy to what occurred 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And I'm going to tell you, that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. Say legacy. Legacy. The shoulders from which we stand on, those of you who have the privileges to sit in this facility and sit in the classroom are able to do so because of the legacy of many folks in our community, particularly the individual who will be speaking to you tonight. You have a responsibility to keep in the context while you're here, to preserve the opportunity that has been given to you, and to expand upon the legacy that has been given to you. And so you have a responsibility to expand build on the success that others have come before you. And so I'm going to quote somebody that we usually don't quote. I'm going to quote the great Deion Sanders, the Hall of Fame cornerback. Deion Sanders said, if your dream isn't bigger than you, then there's something wrong with your dream. Welcome to MCC Penn Valley, and I look forward to hearing our illustrious speaker tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Seabrooks. And listen, if you had been my campaign manager in 2007, I probably would have been the mayor. Thank you so very much. There are those that would say that the movement of civil rights started with Dr. Martin Luther King and the bus boycott in Montgomery. And there are those that would say it started probably in the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. I say the movement started in 1619 when those 20 indentured servants standing on the southeast shores here in the so-called New World. And the movement is far from being over. And so each one of us in some way, some form of fashion, are taking advantage of that movement. And again, it's not over yet. We're sharing some thoughts out in the hallway, and I said that the leadership in any society must pass the baton on to those leaders that come after them. But each one of us have an obligation to carry the baton. And let us not become so cozy that we feel that the movement does not affect us. The movement cuts across all race and ethnic and religious and status in life and colors, sexual orientation. That's the movement for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in these United States of America, 1/5 of the world's population. And I'm convinced that that civil rights movement also started when the Creator created heaven and earth and everything therein, and then decided to make humankind. And the question is, how in the likeness and image of the Creator? That means each one of us is made in the likeness and image of the Creator. And so whether you be Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Buddhist, Baha'i, whatever the case might be, regardless of your color, your status in life, or your sexual orientation, we're all a part of that same Creator and in the likeness and image of that Creator. Isn't it time that we begin to act like that? If not now, when, is the question. That being said, let me introduce to you the one who's going to do some introduction. A young lady that I'm very fond of who grew up in this community, a lawyer, and one who was just recently appointed to the Associate Circuit Court, 16th Judicial Circuit here in Jackson County. One who is the first African-American woman to serve on the Associate Circuit Court. Would you help me welcome Associate Circuit Judge Jalilah Otto. Ms. Otto, please.
Good evening. Ooh. I did break it. They don't teach you that in law school. I'm so excited to be here tonight for 3 reasons, one of which is to be a part of the Brooks Institute. This is the second program that I've had the pleasure and honor to be a part of with the Brooks Institute, and everything that has been associated with the Institute has been phenomenal. It has been phenomenal, and if you see anything in the future advertised with the Brooks Institute, know you're in store for a phenomenal program. The second reason I'm excited is a few years ago, I used to teach over at Penn Valley with Dr. Curls, and I'm so honored that she remembers me after all of these years, but my students from Penn Valley still contact me now, all these years later. And the third reason I'm so excited to be here is that I have the honor and privilege to introduce a civil rights champion. We hear about civil rights leaders, we hear about civil rights workers, but we're going to hear from a civil rights champion tonight. And the difference between a champion and a worker or a leader is it's something that's born inside of you. It's something innate. It's something you can't escape no matter what you do. And our speaker tonight, former Judge D'ArmyBailey, is that civil rights champion. He was born in the segregated South in 1941 in Memphis, Tennessee. He began his college education at the Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But in the 1960s, his path took a different turn due to his civil rights activities and his anti-segregation actions. He went on to graduate from Clark University in Massachusetts with a Bachelor of Arts degree, and then from Yale Law School in 1967. His first job out of law school could have been at a big firm. It could have been a lot of places making a lot of money, but he chose to become the national director of the Law Students' Civil Rights Research Council in 1967 in New York. He then moved on to California and became a staff attorney at the Neighborhood Legal Assistance Foundation in San Francisco. In 1971, he was elected to the City Council in Berkeley, California, and he was known for his radical civil rights views on all sorts of issues. Eventually, Mr. Bailey returned to his hometown of Memphis, Tennessee in 1974, where he practiced law from 1974 to 1990. And in 1990, he was elected circuit judge in the 30th Judicial Circuit in Tennessee. He was reelected to that position in 1998. So that's the professional side of your speaker tonight. The champion side is what began in 1983 when he began his life's work and honor of creating a legacy. We just heard about a legacy, and that's when he began creating a legacy, when he began to try and preserve the Lorraine Motel in Atlanta. And that's the hotel that you guys I'm sorry, Memphis. I can't read my own notes, in Memphis. And I've actually been there, so I really should know. But he began his life's work there, and that's where we know that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Judge Bailey worked tirelessly to preserve the hotel, and in 1991, he achieved his goal when it became known as the National Civil Rights Museum. You don't create a museum overnight. You create a museum when you're a champion and when you're championing the right thing. And it's my honor to bring before you Judge D'ArmyBailey.
The question is not if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? The question is, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? That's the question.
When Dr. King said that we got difficult days ahead, he said, I'm not worried about that now. God has allowed me to go to the mountaintop, and I peeped over and I seen the promised land.
Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world.
I see the men and women in Wisconsin. It's a flashback of what we was going through at that time, and it hurts.
We've got some difficult days ahead.
They need a union. They need a union. Union is the best thing that ever happened to them. Everybody needs a union. You need somebody to represent you.
If you don't stand strong, if you don't stand strong and together, you're going to lose. We had to have the community. We had to stand strong. And for 1,300 people to stand together for 65 days, that was amazing. And this is what won the strike. And this is what will carry you over, is standing together.
It's a great honor to have been asked to participate in this program. I want to thank Dr. Curls for inviting me, and you and the staff at MCC-Penn Valley have been most gracious in getting me here, and my wife, Adrian, who came here with me from Memphis, my friend Clinton Adams, and Anita Perrin, who was my wife's schoolmate, and Kitty over at Stevens College here. I had the great privilege of chatting briefly today with President Seabrooks, and you've got in your president a man of great vision, great leadership, great experience, and great courage. In just the brief time that I had the chance to talk with him, I could see those qualities, and you are indeed fortunate to have someone like that as your leader. Brother Brooks, thank you very much for your leadership in this community. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm honored to be in your presence and to share this program with you. I also see one of my old friends from my school days, Brother Talbot, Trustee Talbot, who was at Yale undergraduate when I was studying law school. He reminded me that he was at the door, holding the door at the parties to see who got in, and I always tried to get in free. My wife said, well, you knew my husband then. So here we are, Black History Month, and I stand against the backdrop of these courageous men who were fighting in Memphis in 1968 as sanitation workers for basic human rights and decency. And we have a theme of civil rights, wake me when it's over. What's important to me is to talk to the young people here, to the students, to this current generation of people who are going to be responsible for the trusteeship of our future and for the leadership that will bring change to this country. I think back as a young kid growing up in Memphis when it was a very segregated city in the 1940s and the 1950s, where blacks would have to ride on the back of the bus, and where we could only go to the zoo on Thursdays, and if it was a holiday, we couldn't go there, and the whites would go, and to the amusement park on Tuesdays unless it was holiday, and then the whites would go and walk up into the top of the movie theaters before we could watch a movie. I remember those times as a young person, and one could think that, well, how do people maintain a sense of spirit and a sense of dignity and a sense of vision and hope against such extraordinary odds of a society that imprisons you with these vicious manners of discrimination and prejudice? And yet, black people did. I talk to young kids now in schools, and I have to remind them that they're the survivors. And as young people look for some sense of self and of worth and of strength, they must recognize that they're the ones who survived after 1619 when those slaves started being brought over here. They were the strong ones who didn't die in the bottom of those ships, but that persevered on through the Middle Passage and the voyages at sea and through slavery and through lynchings and through decades of rampant discrimination in this country. They survived. And those are those who have come before you and passed on the strength and the heritage of struggle and change. When I left Memphis in 1959 as a young college student, I went off to an all-black college in Baton Rouge, Southern University, nation's largest all-black school. First person of my generation of my family to go to college. And I went off to college, as many young college students did, basically to get a degree, I thought, and perhaps have a good job to better myself, because those were the values that we would instill with as young people. And to have a good time. I went to school that had lots of lovely women and partying students, and so I thought I was going to really have a great time at Southern University in Baton Rouge. Little did I know that in 1959, as I went as a 17-year-old freshman to that university, that I was stepping off into history, because it was within that first year that I was at Southern that those 4 black college students at North Carolina A&T sat in at the lunch counter and refused to leave the white section. And the message of those 4 students who did this on their own reverberated throughout black college campuses across the South, and other students got that message and saw that if those 4 kids could, on their initiative, spark a movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, that students at other college campuses across the South could do the same. And so at Southern University, a month later, 20 of my fellow students went down and sat in at the segregated lunch counter in downtown Baton Rouge and were arrested. And then some other students went behind them. And you have to understand that if you get engaged in the struggle for change, then you're going to face opposition, and you're going to face setbacks, and you're going to face, even within your own community, those who will try to thwart your efforts somewhat. And the university administration repressed those students who went and got arrested. And some of those students were thrown out of school by black administration. Why how could a black administration throw black college students out of a black school for protesting against racial segregation? Because it was a state-controlled university. And those administrators had to make choices between whether or not they would maintain their own positions or whether they would do what the state government wanted them to do, which was to quell the protest. And many of these students were expelled. And things quieted down. There are some students here from the law school, I understand, and one of the leading cases that came out of that demonstration at Southern University was a case called Cox versus Louisiana, where one of the protest leaders, a preacher by the name of B. Elton Cox, was arrested in downtown Baton Rouge, where 3,000 of us students marched from the Southern University campus to downtown because some of our fellow students, not in 1960, but by 1962, and segregation was still present in the city, had marched to downtown Baton Rouge to protest some of our fellow students being in jail. And as we stood there on a rainy day, and these students began to sing out of the jailhouse windows, and we were gathered there with a line of police and jeering, onlooking whites who were hostile to our presence on a dreary, rainy day in downtown Baton Rouge. And the students began to sing, and I write about that day in my book, The Education of a Black Radical. It is impossible to describe what it feels like to be shot with tear gas. I could say it makes your skin sting and burn so badly that you think it is peeling off of your hands and face. I could say it makes your eyes feel as though they have been set on fire, and then it makes your eyes water so steadily you cannot see. I could say that when the harsh, pungent gas fills your lungs, it is as if 2 great hands have reached up and squeezed your diaphragm and then placed a bag over your head so you cannot breathe. But these descriptions, while accurate, don't convey the full effect of the experience. Even more difficult to explain is that the anger I felt that December afternoon as the tear gas canisters exploded throughout the streets of downtown Baton Rouge was of an intensity I had never before known. All the hellish years, all the indignity and injustice that I had been insulted, all of the times that I had been insulted welled up inside of me. All those feelings and memories broke through the walls of restraint I had built around them and came together in one hard mass of anger. And some part of me said, no more. Some part of me said, I will not live my life in the back alleyways of the world. And I hardened myself to the fact that though my purpose was good, if I stood by it, anything could happen. The instant Sheriff Clemens hollered, move him out, one of the deputies threw a tear gas canister that struck Reverend Cox on the ankle as it exploded, knocking him to the ground. As several students rushed to carry Cox off to safety, canisters exploded in quick succession up and down St. Louis Street. Confused and hysterical, we all began running, blindly trying to escape the swirling gas. Shoes, umbrellas, and purses littered the streets. I could hear the unmistakable barking of police dogs and the whining of the sirens mixing with the almost overwhelming noise of student screams, scattered singing, and the sharp explosions of the tear gas canisters. Of course, there was nothing to do but run. To run as fast as you could and to try not to wipe your eyes, because as I found out later, that only made it worse. As I ducked down the nearest alley, I reminded myself that I had known that this was a possibility before I had agreed to come. I reminded myself that the police could and would get away with whatever they decided to do. I tried to convince myself that I had known and expected these things, but I hadn't. Not really. I hadn't known that I would be so afraid. I hadn't known about the dogs or about not being able to breathe. I hadn't known what it would feel like to wonder as I ran with the police at my back if they might use those shotguns and if the bullets might hit me. But I ran anyway. I ran down alleys and tried to catch my breath in the doorways of buildings. When a cloud of gas overwhelmed me, I closed my eyes and groped my way along the nearest wall. I ran looking for safety and fresh air, and I felt that though I might eventually find some air to breathe, I would never be safe anymore. I hated that feeling, but I hated the white police more. Well, Reverend Cox was carted off to jail and prosecuted, accused of starting a riot. And the Supreme Court of the United States reversed his conviction in the case of Cox versus Louisiana. So what started as a group of students led all the way to the Hallett Hall of the Supreme Court of the United States. But more importantly, it reverberated across the state of Louisiana so that it made it clear to those in power that young people were not going to sit silent and take it anymore, that young people were going to put themselves on the line, and we did, and we paid a price. And that's part of what I want to get through, is that it's not all easy. It takes some courage, and it takes some willingness to stand on the front line, often alone. It takes one person who's willing to stand up and stand out. And so I was expelled from the university in my junior year. And I ended up going on to school in Massachusetts. I got a grant from some students. The students had raised the money, and I finished school at Clark University. And I went up to Massachusetts, and I was sort of a hero up there. They all were expecting the student from the South to come up and talk about the South and talk about civil rights, and I'd walk from one end of the campus to the other, and they'd stop me and want to know how things were in the South. And then I began to look around Worcester, where we were in school, and I saw that in the department store downtown in the Northeast, all of the janitors were black and none of the clerks were black. And I looked at one of the factories in town, and it was all white except for the janitors. And so I decided I'd stop talking to these friends and students in the Northeast about the South and talk about the Northeast. And we formed a group there called the Worcester Student Movement, and we picketed a plant. We closed the plant down. The point here is that students can do these things, young people. Once you get out of school and once you get into jobs and families, of course, it's a little different even today for students because you have heavier responsibilities, you have debt, you have higher student fees to pay. So the challenge to you perhaps is even greater, but nevertheless, if it's not you that stands forward, as you learn these things in the classroom, because what you learn in the classroom becomes meaningful only to the extent that you take those great values of democracy and of philosophy and of history and translate that into yourself and make yourself the actor as a continuing part of that history and of those politics that you study in the classroom. And so we did that in Worcester, and we picketed and shut down a plant. A handful of students, a plant of 2,000 employees. And we brought Malcolm X to speak on the campus. I had the opportunity to meet and spend a day with Malcolm. I talk about that. I'll read a little bit from Malcolm's appearance. Malcolm's speech was a cry for the liberation of Negro Americans. From the moment he opened his mouth, he was completely transformed. The cloak of reserve he wrapped around himself throughout the day vanished as he became fiery and unrelenting. His voice carried all of the threat, the intimidation, and the anger that had given him throughout white America his nightmarish reputation. Yet the largely white audience sat in their seats as if hypnotized while he spoke in no uncertain terms about the contradictions of American society, about the degradation and destruction Negroes had experienced, and about the cruel exploitative traditions of white America. The crowd seemed not to move or even breathe, but to hang on to his every word. I noticed members of the black Muslims sitting and standing throughout the auditorium. The armed police and security guards nervously scanned the hall, their heads continually turning from side to side. It was a tense, highly theatrical scene, and it was such an about-face from the informal dinner of less than 30 minutes before that I actually began to wonder idiotically, which Malcolm was more real. I wondered if he perceived himself as playing a role. Then he went on to talk about his disgust with the preachers of nonviolence. He singled out Dr. King and others and accused them of misleading Negro America, of being leeches and 20th century Uncle Toms, charlatans who spoke only for a minority of Negroes who sought to make their people permanent slaves to the white man's ego. I was shocked by the overt harshness of his attack, but his strong words captured my imagination, my attention. As if the words themselves had picked me up by the scruff of the neck and shaken me, I was being forced to listen. I am not a theorist of nonviolence, he said. I believe that there comes a point when you fight fire with fire, and we're at that point. The only way Negroes can survive with any dignity is if we stand prepared to fight back. We cannot wait for the white man to change. He has proven he will not change. I cannot condemn white men who refuse to hire Negroes because I believe Negroes should finance their own businesses and hire their own kind of people. The Negro is sleeping, socially, morally, and economically. We must be taught to wake up and see what time it is. Muslims are against welfare programs because they lead to laziness and dependency in Negroes. Our members are taught to stand on their own 2 feet. He said that Negroes do not want integration, they want complete separation. The only properties Negroes own in this country are their churches. We have failed to invest in job-producing industries and to participate in the economic life of the nation. I can promise you that our divorce will result in a property settlement. Moses led the Jewish slaves out of Egypt, but they carried with them a lot of Egyptian gold and silver. He said his group chose the Muslim faith because it was the only religion not based on race. Many in the audience booed when he said, "You have to be white to be a good Christian." That was Malcolm X. We celebrated last month Martin Luther King, and we have to recognize that these were 2 giants in this ongoing struggle for liberation. Malcolm, much more militant and vocal about fighting back. I remember going to Bogalusa, Louisiana in 1965 to participate in the civil rights protest. And I was working out of New Orleans that summer while I was in law school. And when I went over the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge, a carload of armed black men met us at the other end of the bridge and drove us into Bogalusa. And when we stayed that night in the city, they stood guard around the house where we stayed. And then when we marched that next day in Bogalusa, they marched alongside the march with rifles. They were the Deacons for Defense and Justice. So there were different strains of thought in this movement. Everybody played perhaps a different role. Dr. King was a voice of nonviolence. But remember that many of us, even the students who were nonviolent, didn't necessarily accept that as a universal tenet for struggle. Rather, we saw it in some ways as an important strategy not to fight back because we couldn't win that kind of a battle. And so you have to be strategic. You can't let your gut decide your strategy. You have to let your mind and your vision of where you're going and how you want to get there and what you're trying to do and how long you're prepared to stay the course to do it. And after I left Massachusetts and went on and finished law school, I moved out to California. And I moved to the Bay Area, San Francisco, and practiced law there for 2 years in San Francisco. And then I ran for office in Berkeley, California. So here I am now. I've gone from the Deep South, Massachusetts, and now I'm in California. And I went out to California thinking, as many people did, that it was a great land of milk and honey and lots of good times. And a young white couple came along that I met, and they had some money. And they said, "Look, we like you. We're going to give you some money to do some things with." And so they made some money available. And it's one thing I have to say, too, is it does take money to create struggle. And so, but you'll find that there are people in this country that have some resources that sometimes will seek you out and give you the assistance, and sometimes you have to go find it. What has happened and what is happening in America today is that we've become overly dependent upon the notion that the only money comes from wealthy corporations, and the only way you can get access to that is to do what the corporations want. And the corporations have become increasingly powerful in this country. even with regard to our civil rights organizations, which have become often dependent upon corporate money for them to survive. And that blunts the message, and that blunts the thrust, and they begin to forget who the real objects of their protest ought to be, those who are funding them. And so you have to be aware of that. But by the same token, I don't want to mislead you, but that you must understand that it does take money to organize, to build movements. But there are people out there who will work to help raise the resources at times that are necessary, just like those students raised the money to put me in college in Massachusetts. And so this young couple gave me some money. So I decided to run for the city council in Berkeley and paid for it with the funds that these young people had made available to me. And I got elected. They accused me of being a carpetbagger because I'd only lived in the city for 3 months before the election. I would go to these campaign meetings and I'd talk, and then when they got to the question period, I'd leave before the question period because the conservatives would have plants in the audience to ask me how long had I lived in Berkeley. And so I would get away before that. And I was elected. Well, when I announced as a candidate, now I came out of the South, you see. I'm in Berkeley, California by now. But I knew from what I had seen in the South that we always recognize race as being the dominant factor, and we always recognize the plight of our people as black people as being important to our mission. And so I had said out there that my first objective was going to be to the interest of the black community. Now, this was in a town that was only 25% white. 25% black. And so in Berkeley now, the city manager's office was 13 employees, all white. The garbage department was 95% of the blacks were in the garbage department. 95% of the police department was white. 95% of the fire department was white. And so we had to fight in Berkeley to get an affirmative action program. And we had some blacks on the city council who would challenge us, a couple of them, one of them in particular, when we were pushing for affirmative action. He said, well, that would be discrimination against white people. Duh. But again, you have to recognize that the allies you think you may have all the time are not necessarily the ones that you get. We passed affirmative action in Berkeley. Sometimes, Brother Adams, you don't always have to, I'm a lawyer now, I'm a trained lawyer. And so I would use filibusters in the council meeting if I didn't have the votes. I wouldn't let the meetings go on. I don't believe that you ought to just sit down and go by proper order all the time if you're not accomplishing an objective. If you're failing to accomplish an objective and find yourself in such a consistent minority in the voting, then the thing to do is stop the voting. And so I would filibuster in the council meetings. And the mayor would instruct we had a 9-member council, and the mayor would instruct the city clerk to turn my microphone off. And they'd turn the microphone off, and I'd keep talking. And in Berkeley, see, they had a bunch of street people and all kinds of hippies, and pot was in then, you know. And so what I could do, and the war was going on. That's one thing that happened, you see. It was by 1967, the Vietnam War was going on. So you have to appreciate the shift in the climate. Civil rights was in up until then, but by 1967, the war was beginning to capture the energy and the imagination of the left and the activists, and they were fighting the war, and so they would come to the council meetings to protest against the war. And I'd go right along with them. We voted to offer sanctuary to any sailors that jumped ship from the boats that were going to sail from California to over to Vietnam, because we saw the war as wrong. But what we also did, I would get the radicals stirred up if we were going to lose a vote, and push issues to the point that I would lose. I knew I would lose, but I knew it would make the radicals mad, and on one occasion they started a riot in the council chamber. But that was additional heat that could be created and put against the conservatives and the moderates that didn't want to make change. So what did they do? They recalled me from the Berkeley City Council. Only person in the history of the city of Berkeley to be recalled from public office. But I knew that they were going to do it. They had announced that day after we were elected. The three of us, they said the radicals had won these seats and taken over Berkeley. They were going to recall us. So what did I do for the next 2 years? I disregarded the threat. I didn't worry about keeping my position. I knew that I was eventually going to lose it. But oh, what change you can make when you don't have to worry about keeping your position. And we were able to get things done. We passed affirmative action. When I left being recalled, we had a black city manager. We had the first black city attorney. We had passed affirmative action. And so we had turned the politics of Berkeley upside down. Now, that's a great liberal city, but it had forgot about us. And we had to beat the table and demand to be included. So after they ousted me in this special election, I returned to Memphis. And that was in 1974. And started practicing law. Now let me just talk about this third element of my involvement. And that was building the National Civil Rights Museum, where Dr. King was assassinated. And one thing I want to say, I mentioned the celebrations of Dr. King's holiday and Dr. King's memory. But there is a book written by a friend of Dr. King's, Professor Vincent Harding, and it's called Martin Luther King, Jr., The Inconvenient Hero. And the theme of the book is that we have created an image of Martin Luther King that's not really true to who King was by the time he died. We talk about Martin Luther King and the speech he gave in 1963 at the March on Washington, talking about little black children and white children being together. But by 1968, 5 years later, Martin Luther King had gravitated to a much more radical perspective of what needs to be done. And he talked then about the need for radical change in America because he saw that the breakdown of segregation was not the solution to the problems that black people and poor people were facing in this country, that it was basically an economic problem that people were facing, and that it was going to take a reformation of the economic structure of America. And that's why he came to Memphis, to get involved with the sanitation workers' strike. Because by that time, the whole movement was beginning to shift, and they were organizing a poor people's campaign to have a major march of people on Washington looking for jobs. And he saw this sanitation workers' strike as a way to highlight that focus, and that's what brought him to Memphis. And so the King of 1968 was a very different king from the king that we celebrate. He was a man who had become much more radical. He was a man who really saw the need for revolutionary restructuring of American economic structures and systems. Some people say that that might have had something to do with his death. I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, and I do happen to think that it was James Earl Ray who came out of Missouri, St. Louis, who had escaped from prison here in Missouri and followed Dr. King and eventually killed him in Memphis. But when I got back to Memphis in '74, the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was killed was a rundown, decaying old building. The man who owned it was a black man by the name of Walter Bailey. And when I grew up, people often thought it was my family that owned the Lorraine Motel because he had the same first name and middle initial as my father. They were both Walter L. Bailey. And in fact, Walter L. Bailey that owned the Lorraine told me the story, said the railroad called my house and asked for Walter Bailey, and my father said, well, this is he. And the man said, well, you ready to come to work with the railroad? And my father said, well, I didn't apply for a job with the railroad. And the man said, well, you Walter Bailey, ain't you? And my father said, yeah. The man said, well, do you want the job or don't you? Now, the man who owned Lorraine claimed my father got the job that he was supposed to get working for the railroad. But Mr. Bailey owned the Lorraine at the time of the assassination. In fact, his wife helped him run it, had a stroke the night of the assassination, and died a few days later. But as I said, he was struggling to keep the doors open at this important institution. And so in 1982, 8 years after I returned to Memphis, the Lorraine went into foreclosure because the man who held the mortgages said that Mr. Bailey was not keeping the payments up. And that's when I and a small group of people in Memphis raised $144,000, and I did the bidding and bought the Lorraine Motel in the foreclosure auction in December of 1982. Now, I'm practicing law. I'm not really there to run a motel. We told Mr. Bailey to keep running it, not to have the prostitutes as open in front of the place, because that was mostly what the business was by then, and because downtown had decayed. And in some ways, they did history of service by helping that place to survive in the tough times. And so we bought it in '82. What do you do with it? Well, this is where my experience in the civil rights movement, and I felt that I was blessed to have had those experiences, came into play. I had been on the front porch sitting with Fannie Lou Hamer in Ruleville, Mississippi, and listened to her talk about her experiences and saw her courage. This year, 2014, marks the 50th anniversary of those three students, not students, but young people, Mickey Swerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and buried in a dam. It's 50 years ago now. In fact, next month they're going to have a conference down there at Tougaloo College about the veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. But in fact, I was arrested in Washington, D.C. the same day with Mickey Swerner in a demonstration against a segregated amusement park in Baltimore County, Maryland, on July 4th, 1963. So when we bought the Lorraine, I remembered these people. I'd been on the march down in Mississippi, the Meredith March, against fear when he'd been shot in the back, and I went and stopped to use a restroom as I was driving out with some friends to join that march, and the car stopped on the street, and I walked up the little hill to the service station, and there was some white men in the service bay, and I said, can you show me where the restroom is? And the man said, sure. And I followed him out, and he took me to the back of the building. He said, you see that hole there? He said, you use it there. And when you finish, you take a shovel and cover it up. And so I went on back down and got in the car and stopped at some black lady's house down the road and used an outhouse. What do you do with the Lorraine Motel? You try to make sure that people understand the grit, the bitterness, but yet the strength and the vision of those struggles. Don't cop out by saying that these are days of the past. And so when we raised $9 million to build the Civil Rights Museum and government funding. But what I told the people who were going to build it is, I want you to create here a facility when the people who go in here are not to salute Martin Luther King, but to bring back to life the strength of that movement so people can hear the songs and see the dogs. And I even told them if we could have them have a whiff of tear gas. Well, we didn't get that, but we burned a bus and put that in the museum. And we got pictures and everything, because you're not as blessed as I was to have faced those scenes directly. And so it's a little bit tougher for you to have that same infusion of spirit. You've got to reach for it a little bit deeper. It doesn't just slap you in the face. But and so the museum was a way of slapping you in the face with that, so that you could understand it and perhaps in some ways pick up that same sense of spirit and challenge and opportunity. Now, we had a board on the museum, Brother Brooks, and they didn't come to the meetings at first, and it was a struggle. It took us 8 years to build the museum, to raise the money, and then I had to work with state government and others to build it. And they started coming to the meetings, after we got the money and everything looked like it was going to work, and they wanted to ask questions, and I wouldn't stand for that. I wasn't going to stop the project and start answering questions and govern it by committee to try to build the museum. So I would filibuster in the meetings, and they couldn't vote on anything. And then if they tried to vote, I'd get to arguing with them. They'd get mad at me, and everybody would throw their hands up and storm out of the meeting. Then I would go back to Nashville, where we were doing the design and planning, and we'd continue to build the museum, which we did. I knew then, just as I knew in Berkeley, that my days were numbered. And so by the time the museum opened in 1991, they got enough votes together to vote me out as president of the board and vote somebody else in. But the mission was largely achieved. I won't say accomplished. So those are my stories. Story of the Deep South and Southern and getting kicked out. The story of Berkeley and getting kicked out. And the story of being on the Civil Rights Museum board and getting kicked out. What more can you say? So we'll answer some questions. Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for coming out and talking to us. I wanted to read something in the Iowa Journal of Communication that came out in 2010, and it talks about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and it compares it to Malcolm X's The Ballot and the Bullet. And there's something interesting when you started talking about and comparing the two speakers. And I just want to read something and ask you a two-pronged question. The author starts off by saying that the appearance of a diametrical opposition between the two, Martin and Malcolm, in terms of their rhetorical positions, may be deceiving to those outside the African American culture. And then she goes on to say that taken together, though Malcolm X's masterful oratory advocating violent self-defense cast King's nonviolent direct action campaign in a general light, essentially what she goes on to say is that because of Malcolm X and his militant position, it casts a halo on Martin Luther King for his nonviolent position. And absent of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King was more accepted in places where he would not be. So the first question is, do you agree with the author's argument when she says that? And completely absent of that, do you think, or what do you think the direction of the civil rights movement would have been, given your firsthand experience, had Martin or Malcolm, one or the other, not existed at the same time?
Thank you.
I think it's hard for a leader to survive over the long haul, no matter how great or how strong. I think that you run out of steam, you run out of strength, because remember that there are forces that are out to cut you down, and eventually they're going to get you. My story is, be smart enough when you see it coming to go somewhere else. And so King saw it coming. That's why he shifted from civil rights to economic, because he was trying to keep a footing of leadership in this country. Malcolm was challenging the whole notion of nonviolence. When I asked Malcolm to speak in Worcester, and I had this organization I mentioned, and I had some whites on the board of my organization, and they said, well, if you're going to bring Malcolm X, you need to get somebody to present the other side. And so I called Malcolm X back, and I told him that they wanted me to get somebody to present the other side. And he said, well, I'll debate Dr. King. And so I said, well, all right. I said, let me see if I can do that. So I called Atlanta, and I spoke to the King people, and they said Dr. King was not available to debate Malcolm X, that they would send Bayard Rustin. Well, Bayard Rustin had worked with A. Philip Randolph and is noted as being really the brain behind the March on Washington. But I called Malcolm back, and he said he wasn't going to debate Bayard Rustin. So there was Malcolm was anxious to join issue with King and he was hot on King's heels. And young people of my age, college students in the 1960s, before Malcolm was killed, were beginning to listen more to the voice of Malcolm, not necessarily a voice of separatism, but a voice of, just like the parts that I read about the determination to fight back and not just to take it, and to build your own communities, and to not be begging all the time, and to make sacrifice. And those messages were resonating with many young blacks at the time. And so I think that Malcolm would have gathered more strength. I think he would have gathered more adherents. But I think that in time, even Malcolm's leadership, it takes a lot of, it's beyond, I think, most mortals to be able to sustain as leaders of serious movements. Now, you get other kind of movements in churches, for example, where that can stay on and on and on because it doesn't basically challenge institutions. It simply reinforces people's need for spiritual involvement. But when you're out there really challenging institutions, those institutions are going to be there. Hegel, the dialectic of Hegel, says that things go through a cycle, and that there is the period of time which he calls the thesis, which is the time that we're in now, when we've got a black president and we've got increasing divide between the rich and the poor, and we've got fewer black people now who can look to aspire and grow versus what we used to have. And so things have settled down from the dramatic changes we made in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s to now this period where we're moving back, and we get Republicans that are controlling state legislatures and making things difficult for ordinary people in state after state, particularly in the South. Working people, not just black people. And so if you take the Hegel theory of the dialectic, you take where you are as things get worse, and then people eventually revolt, such as the Civil Rights Revolution. That becomes then the antithesis, people in revolution. And then out of that revolution comes moderate change. Some changes are made, improvements come about. And that's the synthesis. And so you go through that period of moderate change and progress, and then people get comfortable again. And new leadership has to emerge to create that new antithesis, that new conflict of challenge. Yes, about Tom.
In your experience in putting together your museum at the Lorraine Hotel, did you have any occasion to deal with the King children or the King family and their assets? Because, or do you have any insights into the difficulty that they're having over his materials? That's a good question.
I did have some occasion to deal with the King family at the early stage of our work with the Civil Rights Museum. When we started our project in '82, I incorporated our group as the Martin Luther King Memphis Memorial Foundation. And we then struggled and came up with $144,000 to buy the Lorraine on December the 13th, '82 at a foreclosure auction. And that then got publicized in the national news. And that January following, I got a letter from the lawyer for Mrs. King that said, if you don't drop Dr. King's name from the title of the organization, we're going to sue you. And so we then changed the name of our nonprofit group and called it the Lorraine Civil Rights Museum Foundation, which is the current name. And I didn't hear any more from the King people. Now, Mrs. King did make comments to the media in which she said that what we were doing in Memphis she thought was, quote, morbid, and that was printed in the press. But I was kind of happy that we had pulled away from the direct King identity and had changed the name, because it probably caused less friction and less antagonism from them, since we were not operating with the name of Martin Luther King. And since it certainly had never been my intention that we were going to create that museum as a site solely built around King, because I always saw the movement as being much greater and much bigger than Martin Luther King. So we didn't have any further real problems with the King family. We did get Mrs. King to come to Memphis for the opening of the museum. I went down with one of the financial supporters of the museum and met with Dexter King, and we offered her a $15,000 honorarium to come to appear for the opening, which she did, although I couldn't get her to go into the museum to see it. But I've sort of kept some periodic contact with either come across Dexter King or Martin III. You make me think about the current situation with the King children and the dispute that's going on with Dexter and Martin III and Bernice King. And I don't know that there's anything that can be done to stop that. I know that Andy Young, in fact, had gotten into controversy with the King children and that ended up in court. And part of it, I guess, is just plain greed. And, you know, I'm sure Dr. King would be aghast, but we can't. It shouldn't be any diminution of the great legacy of King that his children are acting such a fool.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bailey?
Yes.
I have a question.
Certainly.
You talked about the three-prong experience, you know, from the Deep South into Berkeley and to, you know, up into the present. As someone who has experienced civil rights in its early beginnings, even up until now, whether it be moderate, severe, or whatever the case may be, I would leave that for you to answer. But do you believe that overall, all across the board, that it's been successful?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think that the rebels that were birthed during the civil rights movement, the young people that came into their own and became leaders in communities, of course, the grassroots movements that developed north and south in Harlem, in Cleveland, in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, with Ron Karenga, in Chicago, even the Black Panthers. I had some dealings with the Black Panthers when I was in California. I interacted with Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. There were a lot of courageous young people in that organization. Huey was a bit of a wild loose cannon, but there were many dedicated and sincere young brothers and sisters that were part of that movement. Yes, I think that the movement has been a great success, but again, change comes in bits and pieces. I mean, you know, I used to think when I was a whole lot younger that I would see this society where people would all be nice and sharing and caring, and it wouldn't be any great struggle for social justice. But now I'm aware that it's a continuing struggle. But yes, I think that has been successful.
I did like the good point that you made. Dr. King moved it from one of a sort of isolated area to a more open area so that it would open up for everybody to be able to go into that.
And I think that if you look at, for example, in North Carolina, what they're doing down there with the Moral Mondays, where tens of thousands of people now have organized in North Carolina. And I think that we ought to keep a close eye on what they're doing in North Carolina as a model of what other communities can and should be doing. They brought together the religious community. The NAACP leadership has been involved. Labor has been involved. The gay and lesbian communities have been involved. And they've created a mass movement in North Carolina. They've marched on the Capitol. They've gone to jail in the dozens there in North Carolina. And we're going to have to start going back to jail. We're going to have to start being more disruptive. You're going to have to, and that's what they're doing. They're creating a great model, I think, in North Carolina of things to do, because what they're doing, what has happened in North Carolina is the very same thing that's happened in Tennessee. We've got a Republican governor. We've got a Republican legislature, House and Senate. And those Republicans have their hands tightly around the necks of these cities, particularly where black and poor people are, and they're hurting us badly, and they're insensitive, and they don't care. And Obama, with Obama as president, has made a lot more of these people angry and mean because they resent it. And we're facing almost a neo-Confederacy within the ranks of the Republicans that are in leadership, so they're dangerous. And this is not something to be taken lightly. It's going to take a great struggle and a determined struggle, and it's going to take sacrifice. And we're going to have to fight fire with fire in order to really withstand and to turn around what we're seeing happening in our communities and in our states. And I think what they're doing in North Carolina is a movement. Now, North Carolina does have a number of universities, and it's a little bit easier where you've got a state with young people in large numbers, but Tennessee, we don't have. I mean, we've got University of Tennessee up there in Knoxville, but you don't expect much out of there. And Tennessee State and Fisk, where we did have a movement to develop. But I think that those issues, that coalition is what I'm talking about. Black people and white people and red people and have to all understand the Latino community, the commonality of our issues. I was in Chattanooga with my wife just a few days ago, where the vote in the Volkswagen plant there, where Labor lost that vote. And I talked to some people in the city about whether the United Auto Workers had done all that they could in terms of working within the community at a grassroots level to make the community a part of their campaign, which they didn't. And so the union shares some responsibility. But it's a matter of the learning process. Right now in Memphis, we've got Kellogg workers that are out on the picket lines, rain, sleet, shine, and snow, cold weather, nighttime, daytime, because 200 of them have been locked out of the plant and can't go to work because the plant has told them that on your new contract, we want a contract where we can bring in part-time workers with no benefits. We won't hurt you, but we'll hurt them. And they said, no, we're not going to go for that. And so those are the kind of movements and struggles that we must begin to ally with and help to build a greater community-based struggle from the grassroots up. Oh, by the way, I have a book that I have outside. It's Mine Eyes Have Seen, Dr. Martin Luther King's Final Journey. And this is a wonderful book, and it's just $20, but the pictures in it are just extraordinary, from the sanitation worker strike, pictures from the night of Dr. King's assassination, not of the assassination, but on the scene, and some very, I think, touching pictures of Mrs. King when she arrived in Memphis to get Dr. King's body. And the night before Dr. King was killed at Mason Temple when he gave his speech. So I do have that book out of there in which I talk about the sanitation strike. And the other book I don't have here, but you can get it on Amazon, and that's The Education of a Black Radical that I was reading from. But yes, there was a question up here.
I just want to say thank you for coming out tonight and speaking to us. One of the issues that's close and dear to me would be the LGBT community's fight kind of for civil rights now, and I know it's an iffy subject to kind of say that there's similarities between what we're doing now and what has already happened in our past, but I feel like a lot of it is still prejudice that we're facing. And so my question stems from what advice would you give to young people who feel like they're facing prejudice and what can they do to overcome that?
Well, I think the first thing is to look for your allies. In my neighborhood in Memphis, there are two men that live together, gay men, and for the life of me, I cannot understand why every election they have Republican signs in their yard. It just doesn't fit, you know. I mean, there's some issues that are just so clearly delineated that the alliances that you need to be making are very obvious. And I think that black people and the gay and lesbian community, they ought to be coming together on candidates. They ought to be coming together on organizing movements. As I said, labor is weak in the country, but what's left of it, white working folks. Because when I spoke of the wealth gap, you've got 85 people who own more money than half of the people in the world. Can you imagine that? And yet half the people in the world stand for it? What a revolution in the making. You've got a handful of folks controlling, and now we've got these moneyed folks who are getting bolder and bolder, and they're taking the money that they have, and they're moving into local communities and funding election campaigns and beginning to control who gets elected to office by enormous flows of dollars. In Memphis, they're doing it in local elections. Money coming in from outside because the Supreme Court has opened the door for corporations and big money to control communities. And I'm concerned that we're seeing an even greater division in this country. If it continues to move in the direction that it is, that I think that you're going to need coalitions of people because at some point oppressed people are not going to just remain silent or peaceful. And as Dr. King said, there may be some difficult days ahead.
We've got time for one more question. I
have a question. You never worked, I guess you never worked thrown off the bench. You did retire voluntarily. They throw you off the court. So I think it would be important if you could share with us and this audience your perspective, the impact you had on the system, I guess as a young radical civil rights activist. And then, what impact do you think you had from the bench as a judge? The different experiences, the different impact you may have had on the system.
I think as a judge, my impact has been much more limited. I was elected to 3 terms as a judge, and I retired 4 years ago. Although I'm seriously considering running again this year for office, but. And by the way, I also, they said actor, and we're not really misrepresenting. As a hobby, I do motion pictures. I've been in a couple of films, actually about a dozen film I've worked on, including People versus Larry Flint and How Stella Got Her Groove Back, and some I didn't get off the cutting room floor, like The Rainmaker and Castaway, but I do get a little check for that too. In terms of impact, Clinton, see, I'm not a big believer in electoral politics, even though I've been in it. I think it's just a means to an end. And that was my story about Berkeley. I didn't play the game. You don't get in there and and begin to believe the shell game and play it the way they play it. So, as an activist, as a person who just demands, I can walk into a room in certain settings now, and the room will get quiet and tense just by my walking in there because they don't know what I'm going to say or do. And that's the power that you need. They say, I don't know if this nigga going to act crazy or what he's going to do. So they get nervous. So that's power. but you got to know what you're doing. You got to have some strategy. Brother Brooks knows what I'm talking about. As a judge, which I did for 19 years, I can set an example of fairness and try to help make the system work for the cases that come through my court. But you really have, I had to do other things outside of being a judge in order to have an impact. I don't think that being a judge I mean, you can be a legislator, you can be in Congress, but if you're a Democrat in the House, in the Congress, you can't do much. If you're in these state legislatures like we have in Tennessee, we have blacks in the legislature, and I feel sorry for them. They have to drive 200 miles from Memphis to Nashville and just get walked over by the Republicans because they don't have any voice anymore. And so politics comes and goes in terms of its effectiveness. But I think being in the streets and stirring up the masses of the people is here forever. And that's great strength. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Judge Bailey. Thank you very much, sir. Let's give him another hand, please. A big hand. Thank you. There is nothing like being candid and honest, is there? Nothing like being candid and honest. And we want to thank you. And also, Ms. Bailey, for your coming this evening. And you found friends here in Kansas City, that kind of city. I like the complexion of this audience. I like the complexion of this audience. Sometimes only we as black folks come out to hear black folks, but the kind of message that Brother Bailey brought, everybody ought to hear. Whether you agree or not, it ought to be heard. It ought to be heard. So thank you so much. With that being said, we'd said we'd try to get everyone out by 7:30, but just before that, Dr. Curls, you got to say at least something. Dr. Curls, who's chair of the Social Science Department, a visionary in her own right, a good teacher, good mentor for me. Helped raise me, although I'm 81 years old.
We are going to close this evening. I want to thank all of the students, all of the community, people that came out to hear this really, as Mr. Brooks said, great, honest, truthful speech, a talk, something that we are sorely lacking in our everyday lives in many ways, especially in our political life. Mr. Bailey has a book. I'd like for you all to come up with $20 if you have it. We don't have layaway, but if you want us to hold it for you, if you're a student, I'll be happy to put it in my office because I think you'll get a lot out of it. I want to thank President Seabrooks, Dean Cheryl Carpenter Davis, Dean Sweeney, as it relates to supporting everything that we do, not only in our social science division, but what we do here on campus to engage community. So with that, thank you so much for coming out tonight. We'll have other activities, community engagement through the Brooks Institute, and we hope to see you there. Be safe. We'll see you soon.